Hey guys, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and well, for the past week, I've been listening to this. This is the Moondrop Crinacle Blessing 2 Dusk, which kind of sounds like the name of the latest Kingdom Hearts game, but is in fact an in-ear monitor. I did an unboxing of this IEM about a week ago, and I talked a little bit more about the details, but basically what we've got here is my favorite IEM with a twist. The Moondrop Blessing 2 is an IEM I reviewed earlier this year. I loved it, gave it 5 stars, and here, this is basically the same IEM, but taken you could probably call him the most qualified person in the world to do this. Crinacle, a very well-known in-ear monitor reviewer and measurer, kind of partnered up with Moondrop to offer his own take on this earphone. And so, like I said, I've been spending the past week living with this thing and comparing it to the original Blessing 2, trying to figure out what are the differences between them and the goals that Crinacle and Moondrop set out for the Dusk. Did they achieve them? So, in this review, I'm just going to go through the build, physical aspects of it, but probably not going to spend too much time there because physically, the Dusk is essentially exactly the same as the original Blessing 2. What we're going to do is spend more time talking about the audio. And I have a little bit of a hint, a little bit of a spoiler in the title of this video if you're a Blade fan. And if you're not a Blade fan, well, you're probably not as old as me. Anyway, one quick disclosure though I should make is that, I am reviewing this IEM, but I am actually, I should disclose that I am friendly with Crinacle on Discord. We chat somewhat often. Just wanted to put that out there as well. I have in the past actually donated to his headphone measurement site. It had nothing to do with this Dusk IEM in particular, but I did want to just put that out there. I don't think it's going to compromise my opinion of this IEM, but that's for you to decide. So without further ado, let's go and get into the review of the Dusk, which we've got here. I'll turn on some extra light. So, like I mentioned, the build, the physical aspects of this earphone are basically exactly the same as the original Blessing 2, which I have here. You'll notice the cable is different, but that's just because I've got an aftermarket cable on my Blessing 2. But we'll quickly go over this anyway. I mean, there's a lot to like here about the build of the Blessing 2 Dusk. It's not a bad thing that they didn't change it, but you've got these clear acrylic shells, which I believe are 3D printed. It's got a nice look to it, maybe not quite as crystalline and glass-like as some other clear shells like this. In fact, I recently handled the Moondrop S8, which has got a similar build, but I think an even cleaner look to it, but that's really just nitpicking. You got these metal panels on the outside, and on the left side, there's basically no design, at least on mine. You can pay extra for a little bit of a design if you want. And then on the right side, you've got the logo with the only physical difference, or the only major physical difference, is that it says the word Dusk on it. And that's not a very major physical difference, is it? Maybe one other physical difference you might be able to notice. I don't know if the camera's going to pick this up. But inside here, you can kind of see some copper wiring behind the drivers, or basically between the drivers and the metal plate. On the original Blessing 2, those wires kind of look black, so otherwise not really much difference here. Worth calling out, and just like the original Blessing 2, these buds are a little bit on the thick side, they're a little bit on the chonky side, and I find that they actually fit me pretty well, but it is probably the biggest caveat to give with this IEM in general. Like, this is, I mentioned it up front, like the Blessing 2 is my favorite IEM that I've got. And at $320, $330 for the Dusk, it's pricey, but I think within range of being a good recommendation. The only kind of caveat there is that the fit is a little bit on the large side. And for me, it's comfortable. It's not the most comfortable, but it's totally it's totally fine. It isolates very, very well. It fills up a lot of your ear. And if you don't have particularly large ears, or if you maybe have particularly small ears, something to consider is that this just might not fit you that well. Again, for me, it fits pretty well. I'm able to sleep in these things, no problem, but definitely worth calling out. Other physical aspects of this thing, I mean, the cable we can talk about briefly. It's a decent cable, not the nicest cable, as kind of evidenced by the fact I've got a different cable on my Blessing 2, but this is a totally serviceable cable. It's not particularly stiff. It doesn't hold its shape or anything like that. It coils up well. Let's do a quick coil test just to demonstrate it doesn't fight you. I think maybe my only real complaint about it is that it is a little bit on the thin side. And that kind of stands out a little bit more because these are a little bit on the large side and a little bit, I don't want to say heavy, but they kind of overpower the weight of the cable. And then my only other minor, even more minor complaint, I think, is that I'm not a big fan of this little Y-split thing, this Moondrop logo. I mean, the Moondrop logo is fine. It's just a bit chonky for a thing here in the middle of your cable. Other than that, I don't think there's much for me to talk about the build of this IEM, so we'll just go ahead and talk about the sound. And this is some stuff I already covered in my unboxing video, and if you're watching this review, there's a good chance you already know this, but for posterity's sake, I'm going to talk about this, all right? So the original Blessing 2, just to take that as a baseline. For me, the original Blessing 2 is kind of my neutral standard. Tuning wise, it's a relatively neutral IEM. And what that means is that you get a relatively flat, pretty flat, like lower mid-range, or mid-range, lower mid-range, and into bass. It does give you a little bit of a rise into the sub bass. You do get a nice bass body to it, but it is not a bassy IEM. It is not an aggressive IEM. It is a neutral, very clean, mid-range focused IEM. If I were personally to tweak the original Blessing 2 to my exact personal taste, it wouldn't be much. I would, maybe tone down or address some of the harshness in the mid-treble, and then I would love to add a little bit of treble air to it, but I don't know, that's probably asking for a lot for what you got. Here with the Blessing 2 Dusk, that wasn't what Crinacle was after. What Crinacle was after was increasing the sub bass, giving it like kind of a little sub bass shelf, taming down the upper mid-range, and also taming down the lower treble a little bit. And he could probably explain it to you better why exactly he was going for that, but if you pay attention to his website, he kind of has his ideal tonality, what he thinks sounds neutral to him. For him, the original Blessing 2 had a little bit too much upper mid-range, and he just likes a little bit of sub-bass punch for a little bit more fun. So that's what he and Moondrop did here with the Dusk. Now, when you talk about making those sorts of changes to an IEM, it's not every day that you can just say like, I want more bass and you get it for free, right? If you've tried messing with EQ on a typical headphone or IEM, you know that a lot of times there's downsides, right? If you add more bass and reduce the upper mid-range, there's a risk that you're gonna make the tonality not just a little bit warm, but also kind of like cloud up the mid-range a little bit, right? The bass can overpower the mid-range. It can become a little bit foggy and smooth and lose some detail there. That's a risk. The bass itself, if you boost the bass kind of artificially, can become flabby and undefined. And not that the Blessing 2 bass itself from the start was like especially well defined, but it was a very solid bass and I had no complaints with it. But that's a risk when you are tuning an IEM like this. Again, especially if you're just doing it with EQ and not doing it with real changes, real physical changes. And then there was that change in the treble that they made with the Dusk, and with that sort of change, there's a risk that there might be some loss of detail in that region. And the spoiler in the title of this video is I called this the Daywalker, which, as a reference to Blade, maybe a dumb reference, but I believe the line is, and I'm not actually the biggest Blade fan, so this is just a line I remember actually from Marvel vs. Capcom 3 days. Anyway, the Daywalker is a vampire that has all of the strengths of a vampire and none of the weaknesses, right? You don't have the weakness of you can't go out in daylight. And that's kind of how I feel about the Dusk. I feel like all of the strengths that Crinacle and Moondrop are going for with this IEM, they have achieved. And all of those potential weaknesses, those potential downsides that I talked about, I don't think they're here. So let's go into a little bit more detail back here at the table. Yeah, I mean, we'll start with the bass, right? Which is kind of the big deal here, is that the Dusk introduces more bass. And I don't think it's flabby or boomy or boxy at all. In fact, I think the bass on the Dusk is just outstanding. It's tight, it's punchy, it's still got a fast attack. The decay on it's nice and springy, right? It's kind of what you would expect from a dynamic driver. And I think, I don't know, my opinion is that I think the bass on this is not just more in volume versus the bass on the original Blessing 2. I think it's actually a little bit tighter and better defined. And part of that might be what you see in the frequency response graph, where there's a little bit of a, rather than the bass kind of being a slow linear rise on the, like it is on the original Blessing 2, here there's actually a little bit of a contour, like a little bit of a curve to it, which I'm not drawing it very well with my fingers there, but if you look at it on a frequency response graph, it's definitely there. And I have a feeling that that contributes to giving the bass that definition, while in addition to increasing the volume of it. So really, I feel like, you know, the risk of the bass becoming flabby or intruding into the mid-range, you don't get it. And in fact, you might even get kind of the opposite. Like I mentioned, that little contour in the lower mid-range, you know, like, again, we're talking about increasing the bass, lowering the upper mid-range. You might expect it to sound a little bit warmer, maybe a little bit cloudier, but I find, if anything, this thing sounds a little bit more contrasty and a little bit more clean in the mid-range. Now, I do think it comes across a little bit thinner, frankly, in the mid-range. And that just, it cuts into a little bit of that mid-range warmth that you get here on the Blessing 2. Now, whether or not that's to your taste, that's of course going to be up to personal preference. But it was interesting to me that the effect of that extra bass and that mid-range drop was almost the opposite of what I would have expected. To me, this just seems like an even clearer and cleaner sound than the original Blessing 2. Now to the treble, I gotta say, like, honestly, to my ear, I don't hear the treble difference. I definitely recognize that it's there in the graph, but there's a couple dB drop in the treble. To my ear, I actually didn't notice really any difference in the treble between these two different sets. So while that might be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what you wanted out of the treble of a B2, a Blessing 2 retune, I think any risk that there's a loss of detail there is not realized here with the Dusk, which is, again, why I call this thing the Daywalker. It's got all the benefits of what Crinacle was going for and none of the potential downsides. I think that he just kind of, I don't know, I feel like they kind of nailed it. Now, that brings up the question, does that mean that the Dusk is just strictly better than the Blessing 2? And in my opinion, it's a little bit more complicated than that. My take is that, and maybe this is going to sound like a bit of a cop-out, my take is that this is just a different flavor of the Blessing 2. The Dusk and the Blessing 2 vanilla. You got to pick your poison. Do you want something like the original Blessing 2 that's a little bit of a mid-range specialist? It's just got that fullness in the mid-range, which can play well with male vocals, or, you know, some albums like The Cure's Disintegration. It's just a very full sounding album, the way that it's mastered, and it comes across really, really well on the Blessing 2. Here on the Dusk, it's a little bit thinner. At least that's my impression, but you do get that sub-bass emphasis, and I think most people are going to prefer the tuning of the Dusk 2, just because neutral, kind of a warm neutral tune's not for everybody. This, I think, is just a better, a stronger all-arounder, and it's easier to recommend for most people. Again, the Blessing 2, my only caveat with recommending that previously was that the fit is a little bit big. And then maybe the caveat that you gotta like a neutral tune. Here, it's still very much a neutral IM. The change isn't that drastic, but I think that the increased presence in the sub-bass is definitely noticeable. And for a lot of people is going to be preferable. My personal preference between sort of the general all-rounder, the better all-rounder, and the better mid-range specialist If I had to choose, I'd probably still stick with the original Blessing 2, but I'm definitely glad that I've got both. So let's go ahead and give this thing a score. Out of 5 stars, I gotta give the Moondrop Cross Crinacle Blessing 2 Dusk Twilight Edition, I gotta give it all 5 stars. This is a great, great sounding IEM. Basically right up there with my original Blessing 2, as these are now my 2 favorite IEMs. They're again, different flavors of basically the same thing. If you want a more general all-rounder tune, I think the Dusk is that. If you've heard the Blessing 2 and you thought that it could use a little bit of extra bass, but maybe you were concerned about it, I think you have zero to be worried about here with the Dusk. This thing is just, it's excellent. So that's my review of the Moondrop Cross Crinacle Blessing 2 Dusk. If you're interested in checking this thing out, of course, I've got links in the description down below. If you found this video helpful or informative, or whatever, hit the like button, be a homie, subscribe to the channel, and if you want to be a part of the next live stream Q&A, ding the bell so YouTube will let you know next time I'm live. In fact, that's what I'm gonna do right now. I'm gonna end this review for the VOD, but if you're around live, let's have a little conversation, answer some questions. If you have any questions about the Blessing 2 or the Dusk that I didn't get to, we'll talk about that stuff. But for the rest of you, I'll see you on the next super review.